we are drawing near the end of this class. It's hard to believe. Last week, we talked about the American Revolution. We started into that complicated subject, and this week we're going to continue that theme. Just to review a little bit from last week. Yeah, actually, this is from the last month or so. We talked about the Enlightenment several weeks ago, and the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in the late 1600s and 1700s that began, like most intellectual movements do, among the elite academics, and then eventually filters down to normal people. But the Enlightenment was this assertion of supreme confidence in human ability, particularly in human reason, to figure things out, to understand all of reality and all of its tiny parts and how they fit together, and to master reality, and to think of reality more in terms of the laws of physics, and basically using a mastery of those laws to fix all of our human problems, rather than relying on religion, which is revealed to us through the Bible or through the person of Jesus, or wisdom that comes down to us through tradition. That's sort of a nutshell version of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment wasn't necessarily always just straight atheism. Often it began with deism, and deism was pretty convenient for Enlightenment thinkers because you could still have a God who creates everything and gets everything started, but like a cosmic watchmaker who makes the universe and then winds it up and sets it down and then walks away, right? That's not a God who involves himself, like Isaiah talked about, in the messiness of human history. Instead of a God who breaks into history, God just leaves history to run, and then we have to figure out the laws that he made, and then we do that for ourselves. Does that make sense? This way of seeing the world was a striking departure from the the Middle Ages, but also from the Puritans in North America, who wanted a Christendom. They did not want a separation of Christianity from society and from the state. They wanted a unified state and church. They wanted a Protestant Christendom, not a Roman Catholic Christendom. But they did want the nation to be formally, legally under God's law as much as humans could do that. So one of the things that has struck me in a new way as I've worked on this is, how did we get from that Puritan vision of a Christendom in the colonies? How did we get from that in a pretty short span of time to a situation where the broad majority of people in America are pushing for disestablishment of religion? And by establishment of religion, we're talking about a state church, a state-established church, where for example, in England, you had the Anglican state church, right? Or in Germany, you had the established Lutheran church. Or in France, you had the established Catholic church. And there was a very close relationship between the church, the top of the church hierarchy, and the political leaders of the nation, right? America pretty strongly rejected that state-established version of religion, and did it in a pretty short amount of time. And it wasn't because they didn't believe in God or didn't believe in the Bible, but it is a curious thing that happens so rapidly in the colonies. We talked last week about the First Great Awakening, which was the 1730s and 1740s, a different way to preach the gospel, which was very different from what the established church had been using, in the open air, more itinerant preachers, evangelists who weren't necessarily connected to the hierarchy of a church denomination, right? And then we asked the question, which kind of seems like a tired question because this gets asked so often, but was America's founding a Christian founding or a secular founding? And I think what we tried to establish last week is that actually there were a lot of different ingredients that got baked into the cake, and those ingredients have been in tension with themselves ever since. And we looked at this kind of a 5-point sliding scale. From one end, you have born-again evangelical conservative people like Charles Wesley and John Wesley, all the way over on the other end of the scale to someone like Thomas Paine, who's a avowed atheist and very deeply dislikes the Bible and the church. But most Americans were somewhere in between, let's say the Wesleys on one end and Thomas Paine on the other. So we kind of introduced that sliding scale last week. We looked at like 5 points, and we're going to kind of break that down a little bit more. So we're going to look at examples of actual human beings who were in the mess and murk and of actually living their lives and trying to figure out what it meant to be faithful in a difficult time. And we're gonna look at examples from each one of those 5 positions, so you can kind of see real people wrestling with these things in their real lives, right? So let's start over here. Before we jump into that, thoughts from last week or any thoughts or things you've been wrestling through?
I just have to wonder if their agreement on not having a state church was born of not wanting a state church to be of somebody else's church.
Well, that's a huge part of it.
So many different competing factions.
Yeah.
And how would you pick which one is going to be the official one?
That's one of, I would argue, one of the most important reasons why they're trying to put together a cohesive government, and they knew that if you have these different denominations, they kind of assumed from the beginning that they weren't going to be able to solve those problems, and that those would be an impediment to putting together a national government. So that's definitely a big part of it.
Well, and also were they fleeing, like to come over here to get away from all
Yeah,
of that?
that's also exactly right. A great many of them were religious minorities in Europe, fleeing religious persecution, and I don't want that here. That's both of those things are closely connected, and both very big factors. Yeah. Good. Good. Those are good thoughts. Okay, so let's look at a couple of people who are what I would describe as way over on this end of the scale of conservative. They would fit very well in our church, evangelical, Bible-believing, and also loyalists to the king and to the crown and to Great Britain. And so perhaps two of the best examples of that are the Wesley brothers, John Wesley and Charles Wesley. We sang a couple of their Christmas songs, Christmas hymns last week. I would argue some of the best theologians in the English language in hymnody. You would recognize lots of their wonderful hymns that we sing. So these guys, John Wesley wrote a pamphlet to the colonies, had it distributed to the colonies, and the name of the pamphlet was A Calm Address to Our American Colonies. And the gist of that pamphlet was, you guys shouldn't be rebelling against the crown. You actually have it pretty good compared to most people around the world. His pamphlet it didn't get any traction, or got very little traction in America. It was out of sync with the spirit of the age. in that tract, or in that pamphlet, they defined liberty as freedom from sin in a Romans sense. I'm paraphrasing him here, but he says, when Americans claim that England has enslaved them, it's simply a ridiculous claim. The only people who can really claim to be enslaved in America are the actual slaves in America. He said that American patriots are trampling on the good gifts of God that they've received through Great Britain and through the King. He wrote a hymn, which we do not sing in our churches. He says, "Thy gift the rebels spurn," the rebels meaning the revolutionary patriots. "Thy gift the rebels spurn with enmity extreme, his patience mock, his virtues scorn, and thee reject in him." They're rejecting God and God's rule by rejecting the king. But again, not many people bought into what he was selling. So it is interesting that if you look at the writings of the day from evangelicals in England and evangelicals in continental Europe, almost universally they were opposed to the American Revolution, and they thought it was basically in violation of God's law, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2. Those people who, if they were colonists and they supported the king, they were called loyalists. That was the term for them. There were a contingent of loyalists. Obviously, they lost, and most of them. There was a pastor, Jonathan Boucher, who wrote a pamphlet, and he based it mainly on Romans 13. Again, nobody listened, or very few people listened. He was actually exiled and had his home and his land and his property confiscated, and he fled to Canada. So these are the people on one far end of the spectrum, and again, being on this end of the spectrum, they didn't get much. They didn't have a lot of traction with general society. Does their position? Can you kind of see why they would? I want us to try to sit in the shoes of each of these 5 groups of people and think, yeah, I can see how they could conceivably think that way. Does that position make sense? Yeah, Doc.
Their position makes the most sense. It would be very interesting, though, to know what arguments there were against their position. Because this position falls in line with what Scripture says.
Mm-hmm.
So it's natural to understand how they arrived at that position.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also obvious that God supported the revolution. I mean, the fact that America beat England in a war, I mean, they were dominating the entire world.
They were the global superpower at the time.
I mean, it would be like Belarus beating the United States in a war. I mean, it's just ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous.
I think, so I also believe what the Bible says, that nations rise and fall on God's sovereignty, right? So I think the fact that America exists is God's providence. I'm thankful that I'm thankful that America exists and that I am an American. I don't know if it's, you could say, like, how did Vietnam defeat the United States? Part of it is because we were fighting on their territory, and we eventually get tired and then go home. And then whenever you're fighting on somebody else's property, if you eventually stop fighting and they don't, the little guy is often going to win. But you make a valid point. The British military might far exceeded anything that the colonial armies could put forth. Yeah.
Nathan, would you say they are writing these things to believers in the churches? Because in my head, you have on one side the making these theological arguments
Mhm.
for Christians, but then you had more the political side of, the revolutionaries making political arguments against Great Britain, and so if you separate the two, is revolution or protest on a political side if you're
Mhm.
not trying to justify it through the Bible
Yeah,
legit?
that's a good question. To restate
It's
it,
a good question,
yeah.
but it marks us. Because I don't think very many people in the 1700s would have asked the question, are you writing to the churches or are you writing politically?
They would have assumed
They would have assumed
it's a whole
that it's
cloth.
all integrated.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be thinking in terms of, is this a political or religious argument?
That's a question a modern person would say, because we now live in a thoroughly separated church and state system, and we have for 250 years. Again, it was novel to them. So
We've created at least a solid illusion of that.
right. That's a good way of putting it, yeah. And we're going to make the point as we go on that it is an illusion, that you can't really separate the state from values, and even theological values. All values are at bottom theological. We'll get into that argument later, but yeah, good thought. Okay, so now we're gonna move one step over on this scale, and I probably do have I do have opinions, of course, but what I want us to do is I want us to be thoughtful about. So often what I see, not just in this period, in all periods, is people, their politics drive the bus, and then they proof text the Bible to support a position that they've already arrived at politically. I see a lot of that happening at all points of the scale here. And so what I want us to be is people who the Bible drives the bus, good hermeneutics or good exposition of the Bible drives the bus, and then our politics follow in train behind that. That's hard to do. I mean, that's one of the big tasks of the Christian life, right? Is how not to be influenced primarily by our culture, how to be mainly Bible people rather than first political people who pick out Bible verses to fit the politics that we've already decided on, right? That's hard to do. But that's what we're trying to do, if that makes sense. Okay, so next point over. These are people who are, their theology would be right in line with the Wesleys or with us. These are what we would describe as born-again, evangelical, gospel-believing patriots who supported the revolution. Right? They would have agreed with the Wesleys in everything except the revolution. And so some of the most prominent of these guys were Samuel Adams. That's a name you'll probably recognize. Patrick Henry from Virginia. Sam Adams was from New England. And then a guy who's less known, but he actually had a pretty prominent role in the Constitution, and he was Quaker from Pennsylvania. Really interesting guy. I really would like to, wish we had a whole morning to spend on John Dickinson. But very, very thoughtful guy. So these guys were initially pretty hesitant. They had significant reservations about the revolution because they were reading their Bibles and were like, I don't know if it's okay to do this or not, right? But these were all three guys who eventually did decide to join in the revolution. John Dickinson led I don't know what the military term is, but he led a squadron of soldiers. He had military command in the revolution. Most of the founding fathers did not actually fight in the revolution. Washington did, of course. Dickinson did. But these were guys who eventually came around to supporting the Revolutionary War. Dickinson, in 1776, would not sign the Declaration of Independence because he didn't feel like they were properly thought it through, but he eventually came around to fighting in the revolution. All of these guys were for an established state religion, at least in the colonies, if not a national state religion. And they were for state established religion even after the revolution had ended and been settled. But they were in their various legislatures or in the Continental Congress, they were voted down when it came to an established church or not an established church. I would argue they had a much more, I would argue, Christian stance. They were some of the voices that were against Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson's deportation of Native Americans. They were, I would argue, better on the slavery issue than the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian Democrats. So they were, I would argue, they were letting the Scripture drive their principles on these things. We're not going to spend as much time. I would love to hear a debate between John Wesley and Samuel Adams. Theologically, we don't have that, right? But how did they depart? Well, their theology was very similar, but their politics went different directions. I think that would be a really interesting debate to hear. Okay, so now we're moving toward, I would call maybe the third point on the sliding scale, a middle point. And a couple of guys who are really well known and really represent this position well. And I would say this is George Washington and John Adams. These were men who I would argue were very conservative in the sense of they were very suspicious of the French Revolution. They didn't like revolution just for Enlightenment ideas. They believed in the depravity of human nature, and they thought, they weren't necessarily practicing. So some study I did on this, George Washington went to church, when he was home on his home plantation, he went to church about a quarter of the time. He was baptized as a baby into the Anglican Church. So it seems like when it came to practicing Christianity, maybe he was kind of lax, but he was deeply steeped in a biblical worldview and a deeply conservative temperament and outlook on life. Also, John Adams, I would argue the same. So both of these guys, they were for established state churches in the colonies. And they both believed strongly that this republic will not last without deep Christian influence on the republic.
Which is why he was more faithful in church attendance as president.
That's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. When he was traveling to other places, he almost always went to church because he believed he was a man of real duty. I mean, this in the best sense. He was a dutiful. He knew that whatever he did, people were watching. So whenever he was out, he almost always went to church. When he was at home, he didn't go to church very much. But the reason is because he wanted to set an example for society that society needs Christianity, society needs the Bible, society needs virtue. So his most famous address was after he had served as president. He was the first president, obviously, for 8 years. And when he was retiring, stepping down from the presidency, his farewell address in 1796, I'll just read it. This is verbatim. He says, virtue was a really big thing for him. Virtue necessarily emerged from religious training and commitment. Of all the habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. So we have to have religion and morality if our public is going to work, if we're going to have virtuous people. He says religion and morality are these great pillars of human happiness. He says don't assume that morality can be maintained without religion. He says whatever may be gained, and here he's pushing back against Enlightenment ideas. He says whatever may be gained from refined education, these were Jefferson and Madison, on minds of peculiar structure, and he's probably referring to, it's probably a dig at Thomas Jefferson because they didn't like each other very much. He says reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religion. This is fancy language, but he's basically saying this republic is not going to work if we don't have virtuous citizens, and we won't have virtuous citizens if we don't have religion inculcating it in the general population. He really, really believed this, I think, to the core of who he was. Does this make sense? So he really was not for the disestablishment of state churches, because in his mind the big question is if we take formal church hierarchy and authority away, what's going to keep people virtuous, right? And so he said he believed that a strong Bible-informed Christian culture is necessary if we're going to succeed as a people. Sometimes, well, often when you read what he wrote about religion, it sounds kind of utilitarian. In other words, sometimes it seemed like his first goal was a strong republic and religion is necessary to support that, rather than Christianity is true and Jesus is king, so we need to follow Jesus. Often it seemed like things were starting to get upside down a little bit. In other words, Christianity is necessary for the good of the state, if that makes sense. But he really did believe that Christianity was necessary for the good of the state. Does that make sense?
So do you see that between the differentiation between a conservative evangelical patriots and conservative less evangelical patriots? Is that the primary?
The group we just talked about previously?
Yeah.
I would say the main way I'm distinguishing those two groups is, I think, in their commitment to the gospel. Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams really personally believed in the gospel, and I would say maybe put that first and their politics second. I think sometimes Washington Adams put politics first, and the personal religion was to support that, even though I think they really did believe it. But again, he didn't personally go to church very often. He didn't actually, his own pastor called him out because he never took communion. He always avoided communion Sundays. And people have debated why he did that. And he was a pretty private person. I admire, the U.S. wouldn't be what it was if not for Washington. He was a remarkable leader. The fact that he stepped down, a lot of people wanted him to just become the new king in America, and he probably could have pulled that off if he had wanted to, but he didn't. He was a humble man, a good man who was really key to actually making it work in the beginning. So, and I have a really high regard for John Adams too. Again, Washington and Adams both favored the 13 colonies having their own established state religion. To the idea of a national state religion, I think they thought it probably maybe wouldn't work because they couldn't get all 13 to agree on what. Is it going to be Anglican? Is it going to be Puritan? Is it going to be Presbyterian? Is it going to be, is it going to be Baptist? Which one? They would have had a hard time landing on one particular denomination, if we can use that word, right? But the fact that they did favor colonies having state religion brought them into pretty sharp disagreement with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And this became a big issue in the election of 1800. And we looked at this a couple of weeks ago. We'll look at it again because it's so relevant to this particular point. So Adams and Washington really came to distrust Thomas Jefferson in particular. They had a lot of personal animosity, but they also really distrusted each other's political principles. Adams and Washington feared that Jefferson was going to take them in the direction of the French Revolution, where just anything goes, it's all enlightenment. We throw off all hierarchy and authority and basically into godlessness. Jefferson was afraid that Adams and Washington are going to reestablish state religion, maybe reestablish, like Washington's going to become this new monarch, and he's going to take the country back into the old system of tyranny. It's just going to be the old English system imported into America, but the same basic thing.
And that is American politics in a nutshell.
It really is in a lot of ways. It's
Down to today.
Yeah, how much authority and hierarchy is good versus how much hierarchy and authority is tyranny, right? We'll never stop wrestling with that question as long as America exists, or any other country really.
That may actually be politics.
Yeah. How much order is
Certainly American.
how much order is too much order? How much order is not enough order, right? Yeah. So we touched on this a couple weeks ago, but the election of 1800. If you think our politics are contentious, go read some stuff from the election of 1800. Like they called each other all kinds of horrible names. They didn't pull any punches at all. You had so Adams followed George Washington, so he won the election of -- and was president from 1796 to 1800. So Adams was running as the incumbent for re-election in 1800 against Thomas Jefferson, and they really, really came to deeply dislike one another. In a similar way to, say, Trump and Biden really disliked each other and really had pretty different worldviews about how some of the underpinnings of politics. Yeah.
When you talk about Adams, you talk about John Adams, not Samuel Adams.
Yeah, sorry, John Adams, yeah. Yeah. So John Adams, again, we talked about him just a moment ago. He was from New England. He had Puritan roots. He really was more religiously orthodox than Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was running to unseat Adams. Jefferson, I think, could safely be described as a deist. He didn't believe in the divinity. Of course, he didn't advertise these things at the time, but he didn't believe in the divinity of Christ or the Trinity. He supported the French Revolution, at least in its early phases. So we looked at this a couple weeks ago, but the most famous, just like today, in fact, probably more so than today, the whole fair and balanced thing, we think that news organizations should be fair and balanced. That's kind of a new thing. That newspapers always picked a side historically. And so anyway, there was the most widely circulated conservative newspaper of the day was the Philadelphia, I think it was the Philadelphia Gazette or Philadelphia Inquirer. And they continually ran an ad leading up to the election of 1800. They were in support of John Adams. And they said, this is you can't see it from where you're sitting, but it says, "Shall I continue in allegiance to God and a religious president," meaning John Adams, the incumbent, "or should I impiously declare for Jefferson and no God?" Right? So they're saying if you vote for Jefferson, you're voting against God. If you vote for Adams, you're voting for God and for religious conservatism. Jefferson won the election. He defeated Adams. And after he won, this is where it gets really fascinating to me. Tom, you're smiling. You know what I'm going to say. This is where it gets really interesting.
I'm actually, you thought the president, vice president were divided in this election. Thomas Jefferson was John Adams' vice president because of the way the electoral college was set up at that time. The guy who got the most was president, the guy who got second was vice
Right.
president.
So Joe Biden would be Donald Trump's vice president in this scenario. Yeah.
Quickly changed that in the Constitution.
Yeah, they realized that wasn't actually going to work. Yeah. Okay, so the Danbury Baptist Association, which was a Baptist group from Connecticut. What's Connecticut? It's Puritan New England, right? It's very deeply Puritan New England. The Puritans in New England had a state Puritan church. They weren't too keen on other religious denominations having very much say in society. And so the Baptists felt like they got the short end of the stick by living in Connecticut under the thumb of the Puritans. And so, again, they're a religious minority. It sounds weird to say that in America, but the Baptists were a religious minority in Connecticut. And so, oddly enough, they supported, they're evangelical, Bible-believing, conservative, gospel people. Thomas Jefferson really isn't, but they support Jefferson. Why? Because he's going to get the Puritans off their back, right? He's going to lean more toward disestablishment of state churches, right? So they wrote him, and they gave him a 1,400-pound block of cheese that went with this letter. I don't know how you cart around a 1,400-pound block of cheese. But he wrote them back as kind of, you win the election and you write to thank people for helping you out, right? And this is the famous letter where we get the phrase, a separation between church and state. This phrase does not exist in the Constitution. It's crazy. If you ask people on the street, does the Constitution say separation of church and state? It doesn't. That phrase comes from this letter. And this is what this is Thomas Jefferson writing to Baptists in Connecticut. Believing with you Baptists, that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, none other than God, not anybody else, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. In other words, they can't tell you how to think, they can only tell you what to do. I contemplate that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is the First Amendment, right? Should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. He's quoting the First Amendment. Thus, building a wall of separation between church and state, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights. Right, so he's restating his commitment to this principle of separation of church and state, which is established in the First Amendment the government shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, an established church. Does that make sense? This is really key to understanding this whole thing. And this was a very live, what the main thing we're arguing about in the 2024 election is immigration, and one of the main things they're arguing about in the 1800 election is separation of church and state. Are we going to have it or not? Right? Okay, so again, you have Enlightenment rationalists like Thomas Jefferson pushing for separation of church and state because they don't want the church influencing the state. And then you have religious minorities like the Baptists who align themselves policy-wise to Jefferson because they don't want the state influencing the church too much, right? Or the Puritan state establishment influencing them as religious minorities. So most Americans, America is a new country now, right? they still had, the vast majority of people still had a real sense that religion was necessary for good behavior of people, for virtuous citizens, for the good order of society. Even Jefferson believed that. So what's new about America is that you don't have an official Christendom where there's an official marriage of church and state, but you very much have an unofficial Christendom where Christianity and Bible religion is still very, very powerful and pervasive at the grassroots level, but it's not official at the legal constitutional level. Does that make sense? So it's a real Christendom. It's a real the influence of Christianity on early American society was deep and pervasive and shot through everything, right? But it's not a formal, legislated situation as it is in England and Europe. Does that make sense? It's an informal Christendom. So it has, over time, it ends up having less institutional influence. But at the grassroots, it's very strong.
That's pretty true politically as well. We kind of took the formality away and said it all comes from the ground up,
Right.
from the top down.
Which is partly why men like Washington were so concerned. If we're going to take away the umbrella of the state church, we better have really strong religion at the grassroots level, because what's going to hold it together otherwise, right? Okay, so now we're moving to point 4 on our 5-point scale. Yeah.
There's a couple of problems with Jefferson's letter. He starts out saying believing as you do, which I don't think they believed the way he did at all.
They didn't.
That religion is something that's only between God and man, when Jesus himself says the 2 greatest commandments are loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. James says true religion and undefiled is to visit the fatherless and the widow in their affliction and keep yourself unspotted from the world.
Yeah.
There is a very weighty responsibility that we have towards each other as believers.
Right.
And so to pretend that religion is only between a person and God is just laughable on its face. And to think that these Baptists believe that is
Right.
entirely false.
Right.
But the other thing that's interesting is the pretense that government doesn't make value judgments and that those aren't informed by religious
Right. That's absolutely,
thoughts.
I absolutely agree with you. Right.
I mean, it's just, the government, every time they make a law, it's based on a value judgment, and where do values
And
come from?
if you mine down deep enough, you're getting to theological presuppositions.
Absolutely, it's
Right.
unavoidable.
Right.
So to
Even human
pretend-
rights.
To pretend that you can separate the two cleanly is just
Right.
ridiculous.
That you can get human rights out of Newton's laws. Like, jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit, but you're right on track. Does a molecule have a right? Well, what if you put 10 molecules together? What if you put 1,000,000 molecules together? Molecules don't have rights. Human beings have rights, but you can't get to human rights just with science, right? Because does a rock have a right? To get to rights, you have to have presuppositions about what a human being is, right? Or what, and those are theological questions. They aren't, science is great, but it can't answer those kind of questions because molecules don't have rights, no matter how many of them you combine, right? Okay, so now we're moving over to, and you can tell now that these are people getting farther and farther away from what I agree with theologically, and I think what we agree with. But so these are men who are really not conservative in their worldview. I would argue much more shaped by Enlightenment thinking They were not orthodox in their Christianity. If you'd asked them on the street, most of them would acknowledge to believing in God. But when they said God, it didn't really mean the same thing. It was a deistic, non-interventionist God, right? A creator God, but not a savior, Jesus Christ, who breaks into history, right? And saves us from our irredeemable state, right? So, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin are probably the three best representatives of this view. This is a fascinating little episode. It's a thing that actually happened. So the Declaration of Independence, 1776, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote this, but he didn't write it entirely on his own. He wrote the first draft, and then he sent the draft to several of his friends to ask them to help him edit it and make any changes, right? And so he sent, this is an actual picture of the draft of a handwritten letter that he sent, of the Declaration of Independence, that he sent to Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin sent back, so in the initial wording, Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and eternal." And Ben Franklin put a line through sacred and eternal and changed it to self-evident. Now, how is that a theological, what are the theological implications of that? But what do you see, what's coming through when you change sacred and eternal to self-evident?
Yeah, it changes from like God-centered, like sacred to us-centered.
Right. Human reason, human rationality can figure this out, right? It's you see his Enlightenment worldview leaking through here, right?
It also establishes it from a mathematical perspective. This is an axiom.
Mm-hmm.
This is something we're assuming is true that we're building our whole system on.
Right.
If that fails, the system fails.
Right. I don't want to overstate this point, because the next clause in the sentence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." So first they're self-evident, but they're also created. I would argue that's sort of a mashup of two worldviews that actually are not very coherent, right? Does that make sense? So they did believe, even Jefferson believed that God created the world and created an order, but again, then he built all these laws which Newton discovered, and then we figure out how to apply those laws to politics so that everything runs like on a scientific, smooth, mechanical basis, right? Does that make sense? Okay, more about Thomas Jefferson, fascinating guy. But especially after he retired from the presidency, he made it really clear in his private letters to his close friends that he did not believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in the deity of Christ. He didn't believe in the inspiration of Scripture. He thought the Trinity was nonsense. But again, it fits. He had to reshape his theology to kind of fit his Enlightenment thinking, where we do this and not God breaking in, right? He probably wouldn't have liked Isaiah, where a Savior has to come and redeem us from our sins because we cannot think our way out of this, right? He disliked mystery. This is a quote. He says, "The world is eminently knowable. We can figure it out in all its discrete parts and molecules and pieces. And just if we figure out the laws, then we can run it on rational grounds, right?" One of his favorite expressions, the laws of nature and nature's God. This is from the Declaration of Independence, I believe. They like to talk about providence a lot. Providence is sort of a deistic God who made things, who gave us good things, but then we figure it out, versus Jesus Christ, who broke into our misery and saved us from our sins. He definitely believed in a created, discernible moral order. God created an order and we can figure it out. But it's not through God's revealing truth to us through this. It's by human reason, right? By nature, by science, by Newton's laws. So he said Jesus was a great reformer of the vicious ethic and deism of the Jews. He really did not like the Old Testament, all the bloody sacrifice, miracle stuff. He said that Jesus was to Judaism what Luther was to the Catholic Church. It just needed to be reformed on more rationalistic principles, right? So James Madison, who's I think rightly known as the father of the Constitution, he wrote the Federalist Papers, which turn into the Constitution. He initially went to Princeton, which was a seminary, a Presbyterian seminary. Initially was considering going into the ministry. But after something, we don't know, but something seemed to have happened to him at seminary where he kind of leaves that track and really doesn't talk very much about religion at all for the rest of his life, in public or in private. But he vigorously opposes established state churches. He and Jefferson are the two biggest proponents of disestablishment. And I think we'll get into maybe some of the actual wording of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution later. Questions about this before we move on from these guys? Oh, we're almost out of time. Okay, we'll finish this all the way over to this end of this. And like the Wesleys on this end, and Thomas Paine on this end, their ideas were not as adopted by general society. Although Thomas Paine, his pamphlet called Common Sense, published in early 1776, is considered to be the document that most influenced popular culture in favor of the revolution in 1776. He says in this pamphlet, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." He says, "A situation similar to the present, 1776, hath not happened since the days of Noah until now." And interestingly enough, he gives an exposition of 1 Samuel 8. Anybody know what 1 Samuel 8 is about?
Why you shouldn't have a king.
Why you shouldn't have a king. Right? It's when the people of Israel ask for a king from Samuel, and Samuel's like, "This isn't going to be a good idea," right? Against monarchy, right? So he wrote Common Sense in 1776, and then after the American Revolution, he went off to fight in the French Revolution on the side of the French revolutionaries, got himself thrown in a French prison, nearly got himself executed. But while he's sitting in a French prison, he writes a new work called The Age of Reason, a very long 2-volume book. And it's a full-out assault on the Bible, Christianity, the church. And the main argument is, hey, we threw off the king, we threw off the hierarchy of the church. Now this Christianity Bible stuff is tyrannizing us. We need to throw that off too and just get to pure. He fit in very nicely with the French revolutionaries, which was why he was fighting with them. Here, the interesting thing is, Common Sense in 1776 was enthusiastically embraced by the colonial public. When he published Age of Reason, I think I read this week that there were like 98 books, like not essays, but books written in response to Age of Reason, and 96 out of the 98 just savaged his Age of Reason. They really did not like it, really saw it as destructive, as subversive, which it was, right? So,
By the way, we have to throw it off, but in dealing with a public that holds biblical values and traditions, we feel free to use it in our own logic.
right,
Nothing's changed.
right. And his views hadn't changed. He thought maybe there were more. I heard someone say this week that I really respected, that if you were an atheist, the one time in history when you're thinking, I think we might win this whole thing, it might have been at the start of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution turns into a bloody disaster and sort of discredits a lot of things. But that the spirit of the French Revolution was every bit as revolutionary as the Bolshevik Revolution or Communist Chinese Revolution in '49. So John Adams, we talked about him earlier, right? Conservative. He says about Thomas Paine, he has a better hand at pulling down than building. I was as much afraid of his published work as he was of mine. His plan was so democratical, without any restraint, that it must produce confusion in every evil work. Okay, so that's a stopping place. Any final thoughts?
It's interesting to me how people today in our country still labor under the same lies that Thomas Paine believed. He didn't agree with Joshua when he said, choose this day whom you will serve. Or when the New Testament speaks of Jesus taking on the form of a servant and being made in likeness of man. It's very true of man that we will serve something. We can choose what we serve, but we will be a servant because that's the form of man, is being a servant. And Paine, believed that if you threw off the tyranny, that there was mythical freedom from being in service to something. That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So his entire premise for everything that he said was thoroughly flawed.
Right. In one sense, he did believe it. In the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, they tore down all the altars of all the statues of saints and replaced them with Greek statues to the goddess of reason. So, in that sense, it was very much a religious two religious ideas colliding with each other. Right? They wouldn't have called the one. They would have only said Christianity is the religion. We are neutral enlightenment, not realizing that they were also a religion, right? And that's the same thing we have today. People on the left don't acknowledge that it actually is a religious conflict. Only one side acknowledges that it's a product of religious belief. But really both sides have deep theological beliefs, right? Yeah. Okay. JJ, would you close us in prayer?